Welcome to Act and Unwind, an ongoing conversation on a free and virtuous society. I'm your host, Eric Kohn. Thank you for listening. I want to ask that if you're listening to us on our website, that you navigate right now to the show notes for this episode, where you will find a link to subscribe directly to Act and Unwind at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else where you listen to fine podcasts. And if you like this program, please leave us a 5-star review at Apple Podcasts so as to help more people find our show. Today, I'm joined by Dan Huger, Acton's librarian and a research associate, and Dylan Pahman, executive editor of the Journal of Markets and Morality and a research fellow here at Acton. This week, we'll discuss the potential environmental benefits of Meatless Fridays for Catholics and tomorrow's midterm elections. But first, I want to go to college. And to get into college, you have to submit all of your paperwork and applications and the essay that everybody, I imagine, hated writing as much as I hated writing. And then the admissions office will determine whether or not you are accepted into the university. And last week, on Halloween, before the Supreme Court, was these two cases which have been split up, one of them involving the University of North Carolina, the other involving Harvard. The primary reason that they have been split is because of the newest justice on the Supreme Court, Ketanji Brown Jackson, who was a member of the Board of Overseers at Harvard and as such has recused herself from that case. The cases thus have been split. The oral arguments most of the time was spent on the UNC case rather than the Harvard case, but they're largely getting at the same thing, although there are different implications because Harvard is a private institution and the University of North Carolina is a public institution. But this is really questioning the extent to which race can be used and affirmative action can be used in the admissions policies, the admissions rubric of universities like UNC and Harvard. So none of us are lawyers, so we're not going to debate the finer legal points necessarily of what is going on in these cases. But I do want to bring it back a few steps and just talk about the idea of affirmative action in general, whether or not this was a good approach to try to deal with some of the certainly systemic is a word that is used often in dealing with these race issues. Whether this was a good approach, whether it still remains a good approach, and if it is eliminated by the court. I have seen some dialogue about we should replace it with something. I remember an argument from a while ago, particularly coming from the right, that kind of economic status-based affirmative action is something that wouldn't particularly trouble people. More of a class-based affirmative action to get people into elite universities like Harvard. The problem just being primarily with, as John Roberts said, if you want to stop discriminating on the basis of race, then stop discriminating on the basis of race, which is largely what is happening at places like UNC, at places like Harvard, most disproportionately affecting the Asian community, who are often at the higher end of GPAs and test scores and are not being admitted to places like Harvard at the same clip as others are. So, Dan, why don't I go to you first? Was affirmative action a reasonable approach to deal with problems and things like university admissions? And has its time kind of come and gone, and that's why we're at this juncture right now with this two Supreme Court cases?
I mean, with so much of our debate about education, we don't seem to know where the value comes from. And from Brian Kaplan has a fantastic book called The Case Against Education, and there's a strong thread throughout that book that most of the value derived from college education, the overwhelming value, comes not from college admittance or attendance, but graduation. So the idea that admissions does anything for anyone, if you do not complete the degree, we do not see the effects in terms of standards of living. We do not see the value that people associate with a college education coming primarily from attendance, but rather graduation. So whether or not affirmative action, let's say, opens some doors that wouldn't have otherwise been there in terms of admittance is an interesting question, but I think largely beside the point, because what we want is a more equal society. And equalizing or weighing college admittance doesn't get you there, even if that's your overwhelming value. You look at what the United States has done in terms of affirmative action is much less significant than what other societies have done. If you look at reservations in India, and reservations is the language they use there, this affects not only education, employment, government contracts, government employment, even eligibility to run for office. There are certain quotas for religious, ethnic, minorities, as well as genders in many of those positions. And we don't look to India as a model of an egalitarian society, because these things have largely failed. And then it weaponizes these categories. And all of a sudden it becomes a jockeying of, is your group included? And it politicizes all of this. And this is something that I think, when the right talks about, we need to rejigger this for the economically disadvantaged, I don't think it overcomes those barriers. We've seen societies that have done so, and it doesn't lead to free, prosperous societies. What it leads to is a bureaucracy. And what it leads to is a politicization of education. It leads to struggle between identity groups and thinking about these terms in zero-sum situations. So I don't think, we look at the previous court decision that upheld these sorts of requirements. And it's been 19 years since Gutter, and Sandra Day O'Connor had hoped when she ruled in that we would not need this in 25 years. And I don't see anybody on the court arguing today in favor of these sorts of things, that they see an end game to this, that this isn't, that even proponents of affirmative action don't seem to see that this is what is going to lead to an egalitarian society, but needs to be a sort of permanent apparatus to sort of equalize admittance, which again does not deliver value to folks merely on that criterion.
A bit of quick pushback on the beginning of that before one point, and then I'm going to go to Dylan. Your point about admissions mattering less than graduation. I've read Brian Kaplan's book as well. Agree with that entirely. I have used the Brian Kaplan two-part hypothetical question about the training that you would get from a survival course if you're going to be stranded on a desert island versus the certificate of completion, and the same thing with a Harvard diploma. I get all that. The part about it, at least with regard to places like Harvard and Yale and Princeton, Ivy League schools, so set the UNC part of this aside for a moment, is yes, you do need to complete the degree, but the strata of society that graduating from one of those places allows you to enter does at least make the admissions part of it important. Is a friend of mine, when I was thinking, a number of years ago, I don't know what I want to do. Maybe I want to take the LSAT and go to law school. And I remember talking to a friend who graduated from a very small law school in Southern Illinois, that unless it doesn't matter where you went to law school once you pass the bar exam, but if you want to ever argue cases in front of the Supreme Court or be a justice on the Supreme Court, or really probably a significant one on most courts of appeals, you probably need to go to Harvard, Yale, maybe Columbia, and now thanks to Amy Coney Barrett, we can probably throw in the University of Notre Dame as well. So it does matter from that perspective on the Ivy League side of things, the admissions part, because you're never going to get to the opportunity to graduate unless you get in on the admissions side of things. But what I think also deserves some more dilation is it's not, with affirmative action, is not just about who the affirmative action is helping to get in. We also will go through, I think, these kinds of recriminations over time about who this program has been used to keep out. And what we're seeing right now with Asian Americans is remarkably similar to what a lot of institutes of higher learning did decades ago with regard to Jews in institutions of higher learning, of seeing that, like, we just have too many Jews here, so we're going to institute these policies, and in giving preferential treatment to one group, it is simultaneously empowering you to treat more negatively another group of people. And you hear the arguments in favor of, like, we need to help these people out, and that's why we need affirmative action. But we can see in these cases as well, and we see it in the Harvard case, particularly with regard to Asian Americans, there is a pretty clear motivation to say we have too many of these kinds of people, and we need to let others in to reduce the number of these people that we've got here, which just even saying that not as a proponent of this idea just feels incredibly gross.
So I think there's a lot of terms, concepts we should parse out. One is to think back to a time in living memory for some people in which American society was forcibly segregated in many places of the country. And in case of schools, I'm thinking more, elementary and secondary schools, but there was, an affirmative action program called integration, right? And most people look back at that and say that was a hard time, but it's something that was positive in terms of giving people different opportunity, giving children an experience of the diversity of American society, that sort of thing. Whatever you think of how that panned out is kind of beside the point. I think you could maybe make a case for affirmative action, a few decades ago on that same basis. I don't think that is the case today. We had an episode a few weeks ago now where we talked about the demographics of college students. They are majority female, and they have numbers of non-white and non-heterosexual or, cisgendered students that outpaces the general population by significant degrees, to the point where I don't see the need, even whether or not there was a need, and however you want to view that, it doesn't seem to be relevant anymore. These are places where you're just going to see less white, straight, male people. Now, that is, of course, the other group that is being purposefully excluded from, with these measures. And I don't think the reaction has been good. I don't know that the reaction is necessarily that rational either, because there's a lot of reasons why young white males are not going to college or not finishing college or whatever. But it's adding to resentment. And I don't see the payoff so much anymore. Another thing, relatedly, if we look at the case for, maybe socioeconomic affirmative action, we already have scholarships for people who don't have money. Most good schools have scholarships, especially, in fact, Ivy League schools have great scholarships for economically disadvantaged people. And with Ivy League in particular, one thing that's been found, and maybe I'll have to try to dig up the study. It was a news report several years ago on NPR. But they talked about how actually a lot of people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds just don't even bother to apply to Ivy League schools in the first place. So part of the problem is they're just not getting enough applicants. There are people with 4.0 GPAs from their high school, and they say, okay, I guess I'll go to the state school, right? And that's not bad, right? U of M's a great school, Michigan State's a great school, whatever. But they're not thinking, oh, I can go anywhere. I can go to Harvard. That's just not on their horizon in terms of what's possible for them. So there's a side to that I don't think is a matter of affirmative action as much as it is like getting school guidance counselors to just tell kids to shoot for the moon, and big deal if they say no. But that'll happen sometimes. So I look at this and I see there's a confusion of terms. So we don't want discrimination. We want opportunity. But anti-discrimination laws, I think, are generally good in that they are a way in which to ensure open markets. And that's the way we should think about it. The market for education should be open. It shouldn't be only for these people and not those people, right? Anybody can come. You can't discriminate based on, oh, well, they're Jewish or they're Muslim or they're Christian. We can't have those people here. They're white, they're black, they're Asian. You can't have those people that, they're male, they're female. You can't have those barriers, right? You should be looking at the academics. That should be it. And everyone should be evaluated on that basis, which is the whole point of higher education, is we take the students that show high potential and we let them in. If they don't show high potential but they still want to come, there are options such as community colleges where you can go and you can show that, okay, maybe you struggled in high school, but now that you're on your own, you're able to get that high GPA and you can transfer in, whatever. We have ways to get people in, including the socioeconomically disadvantaged. So I just don't, again, as you mentioned, I'm not a legal expert or anything like that. None of us are. But I just don't see the case for it as much anymore. I think representation is valuable. I think diversity is valuable. And I think we have that, at least in the student base at a lot of these schools. We could perhaps talk about the faculty, although that's not currently being discussed before the Supreme Court, as far as I know.
There is this interesting phenomenon where as societies become more egalitarian, they actually seem to fight even harder over the differences that remain between people in different groups. And I pulled up this quote from 1965 from the commencement address at Howard University, given by President Lyndon Johnson at the time. Quote, "You do not take a person who, for years, has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bring him up to the starting line of a race, and then say, you are free to compete with all the others, and still justly believe that you have been completely fair. We seek not just legal equity, but human ability. Not just equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact and equality as a result." There's plenty about the end of that there that I disagree with quite vehemently. But I think the point being made, again, in the context of America in 1965, at the beginning of that quote from Johnson there, that makes a lot of sense. What is somewhat aggravating is this phenomenon where we just seem to gloss over and ignore the differences and changes that have happened since 1965. We also see this in other recent Supreme Court cases, the court overturning of certain provisions of the Voting Rights Act, where certain states had to get pre-clearance from the Department of Justice in order to make any kind of meaningful changes to the way elections are handled in those states, was something that could be viewed as entirely appropriate in the late 1960s. But, no matter what one thinks about certain states that was clearly targeted at in the 60s, what one thinks about them now, they're not the same place. They are not remotely the same place as they were in the 1960s, which I think does raise the question of above and beyond the legal concerns that we're talking about here. It's perfectly reasonable to ask, to address the problem that Johnson is hinting at here, if affirmative action was the right program to adopt. But let's assume that it was. Is it still in any way relevant in 2022 America? And that is something for which I just don't see the argument, at least for race-based affirmative action, being that relevant now 60 years after Johnson said this.
You also look and, we've erected this legal regime, this way of thinking through these problems in higher education. Are we closer than we were in 1965 to achieving the result, parity, that President Johnson sought? One could say that in many ways we are, but I think everyone would admit, both proponents of the current sort of legal regime and opponents, that we are not there. And it is very clear that these sorts of policies alone will not get us there. So that becomes a question now. should this be such a guiding principle to admissions? Should we think about these questions of racial and ethnic equality and diversity as something that we can come to some sort of bureaucratic solution through, particularly by pulling the levers on this one distinct point of education admissions? And I don't think that there's a robust case for that. We could look at places like California that have, that do not have, where this is not allowed. And do we look at California as a sort of backwards educational environment in the United States where no progress is being made on any front because this legal system has been dismantled? And I don't think that anyone can say that the answer there is yes, and that what we have in California is some sort of dystopian, new Jim Crow that has arisen. I just don't see the evidence for that.
Yeah, I think we see this in, we're going to talk a little bit about the elections at the end of this program, but we see this in a lot of rhetoric still about many things having to do with race relations. You're saying, we don't see Jim Crow out there. And I'm just reminded of the speech that President Biden gave, where I'm still just marveling at this term that what Georgia passed in terms of voting rights makes Jim Crow look like Jim Eagle, which I still do not fully understand. It's one of those things that makes absolutely no sense when you really parse it. But if you look at it, it's like, I think I get what he was getting at there. But it is this effort to treat, again, things as if nothing has changed between 1965 and now, and that the same concerns that were at play in 1965 are still at play before the admissions boards of Harvard University and the University of North Carolina, and really universities all across the country. So we will watch what the court does here, and perhaps when a decision is rendered, we will have more to say about this topic. But I want to move on now to an interesting piece that Dan sent me last week. This piece from the Daily Mail in the United Kingdom. The headline, "How the Pope Could Help Curb Climate Change. Reviving the Catholic tradition of meat-free Fridays could mitigate millions of tons of carbon emissions," a study claims. So this is a study that was done recently by the University of Cambridge, taking a look at changes in dietary habits amongst Catholics. So again, in 1984, meatless Fridays became non-compulsory. However, in September 2011, it was reinstated by the Catholic bishops of England and Wales. And their estimation is that this saved over 55,000 tons of carbon a year, the equivalent to 82,000 fewer people taking a return trip from London to New York. So, Dan, since you sent this, I get why it's interesting on its face, but is this even a reasonably good way to think about these kinds of questions? So we want to reduce carbon emissions. Should the question of whether or not we should have meatless Fridays really have anything to do with environmental questions, or should it have to do with Catholic doctrine?
It's interesting because, if you're to take a certain way of looking at this logic, if England converted to a sort of Orthodox strand of Hinduism, it could save even more. So
this is like the theory, too, that, if you're trying to lose weight, everybody goes back and forth about, should I take this diet or this diet? Is it this diet? Do I do the Atkins thing? Do I do this? And really, if you just pick one and you stick to it, you will almost certainly lose some weight because you are restricting your intake no matter what, right? So your point is well taken that there are certainly other ways that they could do even more if that was the intention.
Yeah, and so if you look at, this is an interesting study. And it brings together religion and economics, and it brings together these questions in interesting ways. One of the things to set some additional context for folks is it appears that only 10% of Catholics in the United Kingdom,
I think it's 25. Was it 25?
Was it 25?
Yeah, it was 25.
In England and Wales,
Change their diet.
Actually did change their diet in response to this. So what it says to me is that religion still, even with a minority of the folks, can lead to big behavioral change in a time in which we increasingly think about the world as secular, particularly Europe as secular. We see big changes in this policy. Now, the question of should you base your fasting requirements based on economic impact, I think, or impact on carbon emissions, I think that is the wrong way to go about it. Everyone, if they want to impact carbon emissions in such a way as to eating less meat, more power to them. But however, this is not the purpose of this sort of discipline. The purpose of this sort of discipline is the transformation of the self, and by way of that, the transformation of the world. I think to sort of take whatever the major sort of political hobby horse of the day is and to tie it to religious practice degrades that practice, and I think makes it about something that it's formally not. However, at the same time, I think it's interesting to think about the ways in which religious people, through living out their own religious traditions, do affect the world in dramatic ways. And I think it's a timely reminder of that.
So when Sarah Negri, our colleague, sent this to me last week as well, and the first thing I thought of was a little book we published in our Orthodox Christian Social Thought series called Creation in the Heart of Man by Father Michael Butler and Andrew Morris. And they talk about this exact thing. Should you fast for the environment? And basically they say no. Like, it might help. And this study is interesting, and I think we should talk about how effective it seems to be. But their answer was no, that's not the point of religious fasting. And in particular of Christian fasting, you should be fasting in order to build self-control, in order to become a more virtuous person. So you say no to your most basic impulse, hunger for food, in order to transfer that virtue into other areas of life. You should be doing it in imitation of Christ, who fasted for 40 days in the wilderness, who, many times, fasted and prayed, that sort of thing. And it's a basic expectation of the Christian life. There are three basic ascetic disciplines that all Christians are expected to practice, and that is prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. Fasting's number two, and it really complements the other two. You consume less, you have more to give. The more you fast, the more you feel your need for God, because everything you have comes from Him. So that should be the heart of it. So I completely agree with Dan, and it reminded me of their book, because they talk about exactly that same thing. On the other hand, I do think it's fine to talk about, well, this is a positive externality of fasting, to put it in economic terms. And in the Orthodox tradition, of which I'm a part, I'm Greek Orthodox, we actually fast on Wednesdays and Fridays, and we are vegan, or we aspire to be vegan. I don't always do so well, but I try on those days, as well as during Advent. I think we allow fish for most of it, except for the last 2 weeks, but otherwise we're vegan. And then during Lent, and then a few other periods. So it comes out to about half of the days of the year we should be vegan from an Orthodox point of view, if we were going to be really strict about it. Historically, though, we're not really strict about it. And that's an interesting East-West difference in that it seems that I think in 1984, the point wasn't don't fast. It was just this shouldn't be compulsory anymore. And I think the idea was, well, Catholics, we should be a little less, tight about this sort of thing, uptight about this sort of thing. And Orthodox, we understand, hey, if you're fasting but somebody invites you over, eat the steak, drink the wine, whatever, accept the hospitality. That's just the whole point is virtue. The point isn't fasting for fasting's sake. And I think that was probably the spirit behind it in the 80s in the West, but it didn't get received that way, it seems, and that a lot of people just stopped fasting altogether. I will also point out that historically the West was far more ascetic than the East, I think. And this is, I think, often overlooked, and there's probably differences of opinions. People might disagree, but I mentioned we fast on Wednesdays and Fridays for the West. Ember days, as they called them, were Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. So 3 of the 4 days a week, Western Christians would fast. I don't know if it was totally vegan or just meatless or whatever, but imagine the environmental impact that might have if even a quarter of Roman Catholics, the 1 billion people who identify as such in the world, were doing that. It certainly would matter. So there's an interesting side to this that I think it shows there are benefits to things that are just kind of stuff that weird religious people do, like fasting, for the common good. Jesus said, "Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things you worry about, food, clothing, shelter, will be given to you." I think this is proof of that. This is great evidence for that. On the other hand, he did not say, "Seek first food, clothing, shelter, and all these other things, and the kingdom of God will be given to you." So having that motivation is absolutely key from a religious perspective. Yes, this could help the environment. I do think this is an interesting kind of consumption demand side to a problem that often advocates are calling for. We got to restrict, usage of fossil fuels, and we got to, all these kind of top-down government solutions. This is something that everybody can do right now, religious or not. If you care about the environment, you care about climate change, stop eating meat on Fridays. You'll be helping.
As you point out, too, there's a long history of this, of these positive externalities coming from these religious practices. I think of, my brain first goes to Max Weber, the Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism, right? So when you start examining that Protestant work ethic, take that argument for what it is, that we get these incredible economic benefits from that approach. But that wasn't the argument for it. That's not why one should be engaged in that Protestant work ethic of doing hard work, of honest dealing, of all of that, is because that's how you get into heaven. Like that is how you are supposed to act. And it just turns out that it coincides with a whole lot of these positive externalities. I like the way of thinking about the positive externality of doing something that you probably should be doing anyway, that just so happens to have these benefits to the environment from the point of view of reducing carbon emissions and all of that. But I think it also gets to this question of when we've discussed our Catholic integralist friends, this notion of if you're doing the right thing either for not necessarily the wrong reasons, but because you're being compelled to do the right thing, do you get the points for being virtuous for doing that? And it seems to be the argument from our integralist friends is, yes, you do, which seems to be the reason they want to compel so many people to live in a certain way. But, if you're forced at gunpoint to do good deeds, are you really doing good deeds? You're being compelled to do it. I think that gets to the inversion of this, the argument for this, that's, as Dylan was pointing out, that, you should seek what is good first, and then we get these benefits from it, not the other way around.
And part of, we talked about the only 25%. And part of this is these are people who, at least, find it important enough to self-identify as Catholic on social science survey things, but didn't find it important enough to fast. Now, there is a way that you have to build this up in people. You have to teach them why you do these things, the appropriate place of these things. And this reminded me a little bit when you have secular news outfits reporting on these sort of things, you get, I'm reminded that there's a section in William F. Buckley's sort of faith autobiography in which he talks about being on a flight when the when the fasting requirement is lifted, and he gets a menu from TWA, and there is no fish option. And it says on the bottom, due to a special arrangement between TWA and the Vatican, Catholics are now dispensed from this option. And that's missing the point. This is not about what you can eat on your airplane flight, and it's not about how much you can reduce your carbon emissions. This is about how you live in the world and how you cultivate holiness. And there can be, those side benefits, those externalities to that. But I think, if you want to boost that 25% up, you're not going to be doing it through climate impact surveys. You're going to be doing it by a renewal of traditional teachings on the purpose of those disciplines: prayer, fasting, almsgiving.
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit. Was it last week with the Steubenville phone thing? So there was a whole thing with Franciscan University in Steubenville has a scholarship for students who will pledge to live without a smartphone. They had enough for 30 students to get the scholarship. 50 more decided to do it anyway because they wanted to do it. And they were inspired, the people who donated the money were inspired by Wyoming Catholic College that requires all students not to have a smartphone. And I don't know the results at this point, but I would love to see a study of how this shakes out, because you have three different motivations there, right? You have the compulsion, the fear of punishment. You have the desire for, a very understandable earthly reward of a discounted college tuition. But then you have other people that are just doing it for the good of it, at least their perceived, judged good of it. And I love that the number is more. There was 50 people who were getting no money that just decided to do it anyway. I think you renew the teaching in Catholic parishes across the United States. You don't need to change the rule as far as compulsion. You just need to make it part of the religious culture. You need to make it something that actually matters to Roman Catholics again, that makes sense to them again. And I think that you'll see that participation go up even without any kind of compulsion.
And that's where this sort of study is, where the real fruit of it is in the conversations that it causes. Is people are concerned about climate change, they see the headline, they see the pounds of carbon potentially, and then that begins the occasion, that's an invitation to inquiry about what is the nature of this thing. How can we get people more devoted, invested into these practices? And that opens up a whole world beyond these sort of merely earthly concerns, even if they're planet earthly concerns.
Yeah, I will say, in defense of anyone who does want to fast for the climate, I am a fan of Blaise Pascal, and Blaise Pascal was a Roman Catholic philosopher, and he's known for Pascal's triangle in mathematics, but also for his wager, which is kind of a game theoretical, here's why you should believe sort of thing. But he was actually very much against proofs for the existence of God. He's not like an apologist. What he's talking to is the person who really wants to have faith. The person who has doubts, who's not, it's not like they're a strict atheist and they're trying to have an argument. They're like, boy, I would like that, but I just don't know if it's for me. And his advice is, well, just do it. Try it out. Do the holy water, say the prayers, do your cross, that sort of thing. And there is a sense in which anything to get people started, I think, can be positive. So if people show up for the wrong reasons, they show up to the church, say, I care about the environment, that's why I came to Mass, I want to learn how to fast on Fridays. Welcome them. And I would love for anyone to try it out. Maybe they've never fasted before. There's a lot of people who go through their whole life to adulthood and they've never really fasted for any reason. Well, give it a try. And maybe you'll find that you kind of forget a little bit about climate change, but you start to have more of an awareness of your own spiritual nature and, of course, the spiritual world itself.
Let's move to our final topic, which is tomorrow is the midterm elections. Americans will once again go to the polls. We are told, as we are always told, that this is the most important election of our lifetime. I've typically found that seems to be untrue after every election I'm told is the most important election of our lifetime. But then again, I am without the benefit of being 20, 30, 40, 50 years in the future to know exactly how all of this shakes out. But I think let's, again, stay on a very abstract question about this. How should people think about voting in the context of their civic life?
I have a lot of opinions about voting, some of which have been published, some of which maybe never will. But there's a few things to think about. One is that just from an economic point of view, when your vote is 1 in a million, it basically doesn't matter. Now, I think that's a little too cynical. Every vote does matter. The person who gets the most votes wins. But marginally speaking, it's not going to make that much of a difference. However, when your vote is 1 in 30,000, as the framers intended for congressional representatives, that's statistically significant. That's going to matter. And so what that tells me is people should pay a lot more attention to the most local offices on the ballot, which I think typically are the ones they pay the least attention to. They get the least news coverage, but you should be looking at who is my county commissioner, who is my mayor, who is, whatever, my ward commissioner, all those weird stuff that you barely even know what they do and what they are. That's what you should care about because that's where your vote is going to have the most impact. That's not to say you shouldn't care about other things. I don't think we're constitutionally set up for people not to care. But that's like the first point. I would say actually do your research. You got a day. Before you go to bed tonight, look up those local candidates, see what they stand for. A lot of them might not even have a party declared. Isn't that refreshing? You can just evaluate the person and their stances on issues, and you don't have to have any kind of partisanship baked into it. So I would say that. The other one is there are at least a few issues that are not the same sort of issue they used to be. One of the biggest ones, of course, is abortion due to the overturning of Roe versus Wade with the Dobbs decision this summer. And that is, there of course, are, Congress could still pass a law that would basically say the same thing. So if people are concerned about that, you should care about your senator and your congressperson. But it's much more of a state's issue at this point. So if that's your one issue that you care about, it's actually the state level offices that are the most important. So I think that kind of thinking, and even just this recent, with that court decision this summer, has got me thinking issue by issue, what level of government is going to be most impactful for this issue I care about. And that's kind of a hard thing to parse out, especially last minute before you go and vote. But I think it would be a very helpful way to think. If you are the sort that does vote, perhaps we can talk about whether or not you should. But if you are the sort that does vote, to think in those terms, not just about this is the one thing I care about, so I'm just only going to vote about this, but ask yourself, well, yeah, I care about, whatever, immigration, but what does that have to do with, the board of the University of Michigan? Well, basically nothing, right? So let's find this broaden our horizons in terms of what issues we care about, and particularly which offices are most relevant to those.
Elections are an invitation to participation. It is, I am a voter. I love voting. I love showing up to my precinct, saying hello to all of the volunteers, going into the actual little makeshift booth, getting the pen out, making sure all the ovals are filled in correctly, all of that. I do the mechanics of it, I think, are beautiful. I think it is just sort of baseline civic engagement. It's also an invitation to look not only at all these candidates, but all these offices. All of these people that are in some way responsible for me, maybe only on the margin, as Dylan said, but, I have a say in how the University of Michigan is operated. Not just my congressman, not just my senator, not just my governor, but all of these various layers of civic life. And as you are going down your ballot tomorrow, think about those things. Remember those names. Even if your candidate doesn't win, this is your time to find out What's their address? What's their email address? What are the ways that I can participate in our civic life beyond voting? And use this as a catalyst to familiarize yourself with the various representatives you have and that you will have. Follow up after Election Day. Look at the results. Look and see, okay, who are these people? How did this shake out? How can I get in touch with them about issues that are important to me? And how can I look forward to being a more involved, more engaged citizen next election cycle?
I would say that my important point about elections and voting is I really am desirous that people view voting as perhaps not the conclusion, but at least a further along point in their own civic engagement than the entry point to their civic engagement. And I think the way that we talk about it often frames it as the beginning. And I think that that's wrong. I think we have seen over the last number of election cycles what people for years said they desired, which is they bemoaned how few people turn out even in presidential election years. And implicit in this criticism, in this, kind of forlorn attitude about the people who sit out, not just midterm elections, but presidential elections, was this idea that if we could just get more people to show up, things would be so much better. And the counterexample is deafening, that as more people have showed up to vote, as more people are energized about it, our civics and our politics have gotten worse, not better. And part of the reason is, getting back to, I think, what one of you may have alluded to earlier, just as the decision not to act is a decision to act, the decision not to vote is a decision that echoes in the voting process. And I challenge people to consider that when you have a larger number of people like that choosing not to vote in a presidential election year or a midterm election year, that it is not out of a disinterest or a lack of engagement. For some people, certainly that is true. But for a lot of other people, it is an endorsement of the current status quo as being good enough for them, that they don't feel the compulsion to go to the polls and weigh in on it. And we can raise a whole bunch of civic problems with all of that. If these are people who really are informed, would it be better if they were participating in the process? Maybe yes, maybe no. But I would just encourage people to think of it in those terms, that what so many people were desirous of for so long, we are starting to get. And it does not look as pretty as we were told it was going to look. Things have gotten more vicious. They have gotten kind of more negative and nastier. And I think that is an externality of what has been going on in the country that drives people to want to be more engaged in this process. So I think you should view voting as, again, not a conclusion, but certainly a further along step in one's process of civic engagement. And one that I agree that while I did not vote for a long time, I voted in the first primary election since I've been living here in Michigan, and I will vote tomorrow before I go get on a plane. It is something that I think should be more considered, the participation in it by people, rather than viewed as just kind of it's this thing that you do that's a civic ritual. I think you should have more intention behind what you're doing and why you're doing it, and of course in the things that lead up to why you are doing it.
To quote the great political theorist Geddy Lee, if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice, of course. Now, I agree with that to some degree. I don't know. I think definitely we've seen polarization and participation have coincided. I don't know which is the chicken or the egg. We definitely saw some people say, we want more people to vote. And then more people voted, and they were like, no, not those people. Right? So there's, at least everybody's had that experience. I think there's a decent amount of Donald Trump voters who had not voted before. At least that was some of the what was being said, especially in the primaries. Also, Bernie Sanders energized a lot of young voters to get out and vote for him in those primaries.
There is also a whole partisan overlay to how we think about or how people think about elections as well, that there has been this long-held belief that I think is actually quite easily disproved, that higher turnout elections benefit Democrats and lower turnout elections benefit Republicans. That is not really the way things shake out. But nonetheless, it is part of the way that people think about these things.
Yes. And so the other side to me is I actually think precisely the way people think about these things is what needs to change. So in terms of participation, 60% of Americans on average, and this changes from year to year, but on average will vote in national elections compared to 40% in midterm elections. That's a huge difference in voter participation. And yet, to get back to my previous point, where does their vote matter more? The more local the election. I would love for off-year elections to be the most attended because those are the ones that they're going to have an immediate effect on you in your neighborhood, your schools, your city, your township and its ordinances. But also your vote is going to matter. That representative or whoever they are, commissioner, they need to get your vote. You might meet them. You might be able to schedule an appointment to meet with them in their office and talk about the things that you care about in a way that you just can't with your state senator or with the president or the governor. Now, those are, of course, very important offices, too. I don't mean to minimize that. But when we have this national politicized news and other sorts of things pushing national issues down to the local level, to the point that in Michigan, at least in some other states, you can straight ticket vote. So you can just click a party and move on to the proposal section of the ballot. Basically just saying, well, I agree with this governor candidate or this president candidate, and whoever lines up behind them, good enough for me, all the way down to these local levels, instead of trying to push your local concerns upward. And I think that would do a lot to getting away from some of the partisanship. Obviously, we don't have the media empires to do that because you by nature can't. But to get away from the partisanship of either you are on the good side or the bad side, and the good side is this party and the bad side is that party. Again, on the local level, sometimes there are no parties. People don't even bother, because why would you?
Yeah. This is one of those, again, negative externality problems as well that who has two thumbs and loves federalism? This guy. The problem, though, is all of those, the road commissioner. I promise you, the road commissioner candidate has been asked whether or not he thought the 2020 election was stolen. And this is what we are, I think this coincides with everything that I talked about of this voting and this kind of engagement becoming more of a fervor among people as a symbol of a lack of health of our civics and our society, rather than as an indicator of more people are engaged. And this is fantastic because those national issues are being pushed down to the local level rather than the other way around. How we fix that, I do not know, but it will be a topic for another day because we're going to call it a wrap here. Thank you for listening to Act and Unwind. If you're listening to this podcast on our website, please look in the show notes for a link where you can subscribe directly to Act and Unwind, or just search Act and Unwind on your favorite podcast app. Also, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, 5-star reviews only, so that more people can find this program. Thanks to Dan, thanks to Dylan for the Acton Institute. I'm Eric Kohn. We'll see you next week. Also, as long as it is Pizza Hut circa 1991, I'm all in favor of that. They can win the franchise.
It was
wars.
better back then. Either that or I was just a kid and didn't know better, but I remember it being better.
Something about getting your own personal pan pizza for completing your Book It challenge was,
Right.
It hits right here. Up until, I can't remember, it was sometime in the 90s, Pizza Hut was the single biggest buyer of kale, because they used it to decorate the salad bar.
Nobody ate it.
And then someone has said, hey, this tastes like trash, but we can also eat it.